Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take these dense, fascinating topics and distill them down to the essential insights you need. For our very first episode, we're diving into the world of peace agreements. Using Dr. Paul Williams' book, Lawyering Peace, as our guide, each episode will tackle a different chapter. And today we're starting with Chapter 1, Security Arrangements.
It's a fitting place to begin because security is the bedrock of any successful peace agreement. Without it, you can't really make progress on any of the other crucial elements like power sharing or economic development.
So what's the core idea behind security arrangements in these post-conflict settings?
The ultimate goal is to reestablish a state's monopoly of force. Now, that might sound a little intimidating, but it's really just a fancy way of saying that the state needs to be the sole legitimate authority when it comes to using force within its borders.
Okay, so no more armed groups running around challenging the government's authority. But how do you actually do that in the messy aftermath of a conflict? Especially when you might have multiple heavily armed non-state actors who aren't exactly keen on giving up their power.
That's the million-dollar question, and Dr. Williams highlights a statistic that really underscores the importance of getting this right. When these provisions for monopoly of force are fully implemented in peace agreements, there's an 87% success rate in preventing a return to conflict.
Wow, 87%. That's a compelling statistic. So it sounds like this is really a make-or-break aspect of peace building. What are some of the biggest factors that contribute to success, and what are the common pitfalls to watch out for?
Well, the first hurdle is often the concept of sovereignty. States entering peace negotiations naturally want to reassert their full control over their territory. But non-state actors often have a very different perspective. They might view the state as having abused its sovereign rights, which led to the conflict in the first place.
So you've got this inherent tension right from the start. How do you bridge that gap?
It requires a delicate dance of negotiation and compromise, and that's where the international community often steps in. The UN Charter, particularly Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, lays out the framework for how states should behave and how the international community can respond when a state's actions threaten peace and security.
For those who aren't familiar with UN jargon, could you unpack those chapters for us? What's the difference between Chapter 6 and Chapter 7?
Chapter 6 focuses on peaceful resolutions, encouraging states to work things out through diplomacy and negotiation. Chapter 7, on the other hand, authorizes more forceful interventions, including the use of military force, when a situation poses a threat to international peace.
So the UN can essentially override a state's sovereignty in extreme cases. How has this played out in real-world peace agreements? Has the use of Chapter 7 interventions increased over time?
It has, but it's been a gradual evolution. Think back to the Korean War in 1950. The UN authorized member states to use force to help South Korea, essentially stepping in to restore order and security. Then you had the UN operation in the Congo in 1960, where peacekeepers were given more explicit authority to use force, though as a last resort. And in later missions, like those in Cyprus and Lebanon, UN forces were granted even broader mandates to defend not only themselves, but also the mission itself.
So the UN's role has become more proactive over time, moving beyond simple monitoring to active peacekeeping and even peace enforcement. But this idea of sharing force with international actors raises a whole set of dilemmas for states, doesn't it?
Absolutely. One of the biggest conundrums is consent. Does a state willingly invite international forces in, or is it pressured, maybe even coerced?
It's a tough call for any leader. You need help, but you don't want to appear weak or lose control.
Exactly. And it's not just about the state's consent. Sometimes they have to consider the consent of non-state actors as well, which adds another layer of complexity.
Okay, so consent is one hurdle. What are some of the other conundrums states grapple with when it comes to sharing force?
Well, there's the question of the nature and configuration of these international forces. Are we talking about lightly armed observers, a robust peacekeeping force, or a full-blown military intervention? The tools you give those forces will determine how much power they actually wield.
And then there's the question of who's calling the shots. Who's in command of these international forces? Is it a single state leading the charge, or is it a more collaborative effort?
All of those factors need to be carefully considered, and there are plenty of historical examples that highlight how tricky this can get.
Can you give us an example of when this has been particularly challenging?
Sri Lanka in 2002 is a good illustration. They reached a ceasefire with the Tamil Tigers, but wanted a monitoring mission that respected their sovereignty and addressed the Tamil Tigers' concerns.
What kind of concerns did the Tamil Tigers have?
The Tamil Tigers rejected any state that had labeled them as terrorists, which ruled out a lot of potential players.
That sounds like a tricky situation. What were some of the creative solutions they considered to address those concerns?
They ended up with a small, unarmed mission made up of Nordic countries. It was a unique configuration, designed to appease both sides, but it ultimately failed, because both the government and the Tamil Tigers realized they preferred a military solution rather than a negotiated peace.
That's a reminder that even the best designed security arrangements can fall apart if the parties aren't truly committed to finding a peaceful resolution.
Precisely. And it's not just about commitment, it's also about finding the right approach for the specific context. What works in one conflict might not work in another.
So context is key. Are there any examples where a more tailored approach has been successful?
El Salvador's experience offers a more positive example. They opted for a phased approach, starting with a small UN observer mission focused on human rights.
And how did that work out?
Remarkably well. The UN presence expanded as needed to support different stages of the peace process, from ceasefire monitoring to police reform, and then it gradually withdrew. As El Salvador regained stability, it's almost like adjusting a thermostat, scaling the international involvement up or down as needed until the situation stabilizes.
That's a great analogy. So we've talked about consent and the nature and configuration of international forces. What's the third major conundrum states face when it comes to sharing force?
The mandate. This is where it all comes together. What exactly are these international forces supposed to do? What are their goals, and what tools are they allowed to use?
This sounds crucial. What makes for an effective mandate?
It's about finding that sweet spot between too little and too much. Too little force, and the mission is toothless, unable to protect civilians or enforce the peace agreement. Too much force, and you risk undermining the state's authority or even escalating the conflict.
So it's a delicate balancing act. What are some examples of how mandates have played out in different conflicts, and what lessons have we learned?
The former Yugoslavia offers a fascinating case study because their mandates went through a series of evolutions, starting with ceasefire monitoring in Croatia and escalating all the way to NATO airstrikes and heavily armed peacekeeping deployments. It was a constant process of adjustment and recalibration, with its share of successes and setbacks.
You mentioned setbacks. What were some of the pitfalls they encountered along the way?
One notable challenge was what some called the Chapter 6.5 situation, this ambiguous middle ground between peaceful resolutions and the authorization to use force, led to confusion and delays in responding to the escalating violence, because different actors interpreted it differently.
So clarity is crucial when it comes to mandates. You need everyone on the same page about what those forces are authorized to do and when they can use force.
Absolutely. Clarity and a shared understanding of the rules of engagement are essential for preventing misunderstandings and escalation.
Okay, we've been talking a lot about sharing force with international actors, but what about sharing force between the state and those non-state actors? How do they work towards restoring that monopoly of force and ultimately achieving lasting peace?
That's where we delve into the different paths to restoring the monopoly of force, which we'll explore further after a quick.
So we've been unpacking these complex security arrangements with international actors, but what about those situations where the state needs to figure out how to share power and ultimately force with those very groups they've been in conflict with? How does that work?
That's where it gets even more intricate. Dr. Williams outlines three main approaches that states and non-state actors can take to restore the monopoly of force.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first approach?
The first path is called full control. In this scenario, the state aims to regain complete control over its security apparatus.
So basically, the non-state actors have to disarm and disband no more independent militias or rebel armies.
That's the goal, often through a process of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, or DDR as it's commonly called.
You mentioned DDR. For those who aren't familiar with the term, could you break down what those stand for and why this is such a complicated process?
Sure, disarmament involves the collection and disposal of weapons. Demobilization focuses on formally releasing combatants from armed groups and canceling their military status, and reintegration aims to help former combatants transition back into civilian life. This might involve vocational training, job placement programs, or even psychological support to help them cope with the trauma they've experienced. It's a multifaceted process with lots of moving parts, and it can be incredibly challenging to get right.
I can imagine you're not just dealing with weapons. You're dealing with people's lives, their identities, their sense of purpose. What are some of the biggest hurdles that arise during this DDR process?
Well, timing and sequencing are often major sticking points. States usually want swift disarmament, But non-state actors want guarantees that other parts of the peace agreement, like power sharing, will be honored first. They don't want to be left vulnerable if they give up their weapons before they have a seat at the table.
That makes sense. They need to feel secure and confident that they'll be treated fairly in the new political landscape.
Yeah.
What are some other challenges?
Then there's the issue of what weapons are actually surrendered. Heavy weapons, like tanks and artillery, are usually a given. But what about small arms and light weapons like AK-47s? Those might be seen as necessary for personal protection in an unstable environment, but they can also easily be used to reignite conflict or fuel criminal activity.
So there are all these difficult decisions about what gets surrendered and when, and then there's the whole reintegration aspect, which you mentioned earlier. How do you ensure that these former combatants, many of whom may have only known a life of war, can successfully transition back into civilian life and become productive members of society?
That's one of the most crucial and complex aspects of DDR. The chapter emphasizes the importance of providing economic opportunities, job training, and support networks to prevent former combatants from falling back into criminal networks or becoming mercenaries for hire. It's about giving them a stake in the new peaceful society and helping them build a future that doesn't revolve around violence.
So full control sounds like a very involved and potentially risky approach. What's the second path to restoring the monopoly of force?
The second path is called full yet modified control. In this scenario, the state integrates non-state forces into a unified security apparatus. So instead of disbanding these armed groups entirely, they're absorbed into the national army or police forces.
So it's more of a merging than a dismantling, but wouldn't this create its own set of challenges? You're essentially trying to blend former enemies into a cohesive fighting force.
It's a delicate operation for sure. Dr. Williams points to security sector reform, or SSR, as a key component of this approach.
Okay, remind us what SSR is all about.
Essentially, SSR is about reforming and professionalizing the entire security sector. This could include restructuring the army and police forces, improving training and accountability mechanisms, and even addressing broader issues like corruption or human rights abuses. It's about creating a more effective and, more importantly, a more legitimate security sector that can win the trust of the population.
So it's a more comprehensive approach, aiming to address the underlying issues that might have led to the emergence of armed groups in the first place.
Precisely, but again, this path is not without its pitfalls. States might be reluctant to embrace deep reforms, especially if they see it as an infringement on their sovereignty, and non-state actors might resist full integration, worried they'll lose their bargaining power or be marginalized within the new structure. They might also have legitimate concerns about facing retribution or being forced to assimilate into a system they don't trust.
So integration, even when it's presented as a win-win solution, can be fraught with suspicion and competing agendas. What's the third path that Dr. Williams outlines?
The third path is called limited control, and it's perhaps the most intriguing and complex of the three in this scenario. Non-state actors actually retain their own forces, but they operate under the umbrella of the national forces.
Wait, so you're telling me you have multiple armies operating within the same country. How does that even work in practice?
It's rare, but it does happen usually in contexts where one party is seeking independence or where there's such deep mistrust that neither side is willing to fully disarm. Dr. Williams discusses how joint commands and integrated units can be used to manage this delicate balance of power.
So you might have, for example, a joint patrol made up of soldiers from both the National Army and the former rebel group working together to maintain security in a particular region.
Exactly. It's a way to try to build trust and cooperation while still recognizing the reality that these groups might not be ready to fully merge or disband.
Okay, so we've laid out the three main paths to restoring a state's monopoly of force. Full control, full but modified control, and this intriguing limited control approach. But how do these actually play out in the real world? Can you give us some concrete examples of how these different approaches have been implemented and what lessons we can learn from their successes and failures?
Absolutely. Let's start with the full control approach. Dr. Williams points to Papua New Guinea and Bougainville as a relatively successful example. The Bougainville Revolutionary Army, which had been fighting for independence, agreed to disarm and disband in exchange for a promise of increased autonomy and a future referendum on independence.
So they essentially traded their weapons for political concessions. It was a gamble, but it seems like it paid off.
It did. The referendum happened in 2019, and Bougainville voted overwhelmingly for independence, demonstrating that a peaceful resolution, even after a long and bitter conflict, is possible when both sides are willing to make bold compromises.
That's an incredible story of peaceful transition.
Yeah.
But I imagine not all full control scenarios are that smooth.
You're right. Colombia's experience with the FARC, for example, highlights some of the complexities and potential pitfalls of this approach.
Okay, remind me about the Colombian case.
The FARC, a Marxist guerrilla group, agreed to disarm and demobilize in exchange for political participation and security guarantees for their members. It seemed like a major breakthrough. But a faction of FARC dissidents, unhappy with the terms of the agreement, continued the armed struggle. They felt marginalized and feared for their safety in a society where they were still viewed as enemies by many.
So even when a peace agreement is signed and weapons are surrendered, there's no guarantee that everyone will be on board. Those lingering grievances and fears can easily reignite violence.
It's a sobering reminder that peace agreements are not magic wands. They're fragile constructs that require constant nurturing and a willingness to address those underlying issues that led to conflict in the first place.
Okay, so we've seen how full control can be both a triumph and a challenge. What about full yet modified control? Are there any examples of that approach that illustrate its potential benefits and drawbacks?
Burundi's Arusha Agreement, signed in 2000 to end a brutal civil war, offers a good illustration of both the promise and the peril of integration. The agreement called for the creation of a new national defense force, integrating members from both the government and army and the various rebel groups.
So it was a fresh start, a new army designed to symbolize unity and a break from the past. How did that play out in practice?
The agreement stipulated proportional representation with 50% of the troops coming from the government and 50% from the rebel groups, which sounds fair and balanced on paper, but the implementation was incredibly challenging. There were delays, disagreements over who would hold key positions, and lingering mistrust on both sides.
It's hard to imagine how you build cohesion and trust when you're essentially forcing former enemies to become comrades overnight.
It's a monumental task, and Burundi's experience shows that even with the best intentions and careful planning, integration can be a long and bumpy road. It requires more than just changing uniforms and merging units. It requires a fundamental shift in mindsets, a willingness to let go of old grudges and embrace a shared future.
You mentioned earlier that the limited control approach is particularly intriguing and complex. Can you give us an example of how this is played out in a real-world peace agreement?
The 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement between Sudan and South Sudan is a prime example. They agreed to maintain separate armies during an interim period leading up to a referendum on independence for the South. It was a way to acknowledge the deep divisions and mistrust between the North and South, while still trying to maintain some semblance of order and security.
So two armies, two chains of command operating within the same country. That sounds incredibly challenging. How do they manage that delicate balancing act?
They tried to manage it through joint commands and integrated units, hoping that working side by side would build trust and pave the way for a more unified future, whether that meant unity or separation. But the arrangement was plagued by problems. The rotating command structure where leadership shifted between the two armies created confusion and inefficiency. And because these units were destined to be dissolved if the South voted for independence, which seemed increasingly likely, it undermined their cohesion and effectiveness.
So it was a temporary solution that was ultimately doomed to fail.
In many ways, yes. And as you know, the South did vote for independence in 2011, but then South Sudan itself descended into a brutal civil war just a couple of years later, demonstrating that simply separating warring factions doesn't guarantee lasting peace. Those underlying issues of political rivalry, ethnic tensions, and competition for resources can easily resurface, even in a newly independent state.
It's a reminder that peace building is not a one-time event. It's a long and arduous process that requires constant attention, adaptation, and a willingness to address those deeper societal fractures that can so easily lead to violence. We've explored these three distinct paths to restoring a state's monopoly of force. Full control, full but modified control, and this more unusual limited control approach. What are some of the key takeaways we can glean from these real-world examples, both the successes and the failures? Why should we care about these intricate details of security arrangements?
That's a great question, and one that gets to the heart of why understanding these peace agreements is so crucial. Security arrangements are not just abstract concepts. They have profound real-world consequences, shaping the lives of millions of people who have already endured so much suffering.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, examining these different models for restoring a monopoly of force. As you described them, none of these paths are easy, and each has its own set of challenges. So if I'm a leader trying to navigate this post-conflict landscape, what are the most important things to keep in mind? What are the key factors that determine whether these security arrangements will succeed or fail?
That's a crucial question, and one that Dr. Williams grapples with throughout the chapter. He emphasizes that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Each conflict is unique, with its own intricate web of actors, motivations, and historical baggage. What worked in Bougainville might not work in Darfur, and what worked in El Salvador might backfire in Rwanda.
So context is everything. But are there any common threads, any guiding principles that can help leaders make more informed decisions about these complex security arrangements?
One of the most fundamental factors is the level of commitment from both the state and the non-state actors. They have to genuinely want peace and be willing to make difficult compromises, even when it feels risky.
It's not just about silencing the guns. It's about addressing those deeper grievances and building trust, which can be incredibly difficult after years of violence and animosity.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that peace is not just the absence of war. It's the presence of justice, fairness, and a shared vision for the future. And that requires a fundamental shift in mindset on both sides.
You've also highlighted the importance of timing and sequencing. Rushing the process, particularly when it comes to disarmament, can backfire spectacularly.
Absolutely. Demanding immediate disarmament before addressing political grievances or security concerns can make non-state actors feel trapped and more likely to return to violence. It's like asking someone to jump out of an airplane without a parachute. They need to see that there's a safe landing spot waiting for them on the other side.
So it's about building trust gradually, taking steps in a logical order, and ensuring that everyone feels like they're part of the solution. We've talked a lot about the role of the international community in supporting these peace processes. How do external actors like the UN fit into this complex equation?
Their involvement can be critical, but it has to be carefully calibrated and aligned with the specific needs and dynamics of the conflict. Dr. Williams cautions against imprecise mandates or oversharing of a state's monopoly of force.
So too much intervention can actually undermine the state's authority and create more instability rather than less.
Precisely. He uses Angola and Bosnia as cautionary tales. In Angola, they rushed the integration of armed forces, which ultimately contributed to a resurgence of violence. And in Bosnia, unclear mandates for UN peacekeepers led to confusion and delays in responding to atrocities.
So getting the details right, being crystal clear about roles and responsibilities, and ensuring that everyone is on the same page is absolutely essential. But as you've emphasized throughout this deep dive, it's not just about the military aspects. Successful security arrangements require a more holistic approach that addresses broader issues like governance, human rights, and economic development.
That's a crucial insight. Security is not an isolated issue. It's intertwined with every aspect of rebuilding a shattered society. You can't have sustainable peace without addressing those root causes of conflict: poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, and the erosion of trust in institutions.
It's a reminder that peacebuilding is a long and multifaceted process that requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to learn from both our successes and our failures. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of how peace agreements work and the immense challenges involved in crafting and implementing these complex security arrangements.
I'm glad to hear that. And I think Dr. Williams would agree that the most important takeaway is that these issues matter. They're not just academic debates. They have real-world consequences for millions of people around the globe who are striving to build a more peaceful and just future.
Well said. So as we wrap up this first episode of the Deep Dive, what's the one big question our listeners should be pondering as they reflect on these complex security arrangements?
I think the most important question is this. Considering all the different approaches and the case studies we've discussed, what factors do you think are most crucial for successfully establishing a lasting monopoly of force after a conflict?
Is it about the specific timelines, the type of integration, the level of international involvement, or something else entirely? It's a question worth grappling with as we continue to explore the intricate world of peace agreements.
Absolutely. And for those who are eager to delve deeper into these fascinating and important issues, I highly recommend checking out Dr. Williams's book, Lawyering Peace. It's a treasure trove of insights for anyone interested in understanding how peace is made and the legal frameworks that underpin these complex processes.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic you might never have thought you'd be so interested in.